Well, thanks for coming to today's webinar. This is going to be about our lead data API. This is how applications can get data about leads who have been captured in the IDX Broker pages and are in our application. The end part is going to be about best practices for the consumption of this data. My name is Antonio Ortega. I'm the Partner Channel Manager here at IDX Broker. Have been for several years now, and I deal with a lot of these kinds of integrations, CRMs, mobile applications, anything that's trying to get data from us into their application for a variety of purposes, whether it's just display or doing some analytics on it and deriving new actions based on the data that we can provide. So that's a big part of my role here, always available to talk about anything that has to do with APIs and the consumption of the data. So let's get started. So consuming the IDX Broker lead data in your application. This is things like first name, last name, email, address, company name. You want to keep your applications full of lead data. That's one of the best practices. That kind of data can really power your application to do whatever it is it does, and hopefully in the end most things drive sales. So email parsing is one way that applications are getting data from us. They'll add a CC to the email updates that we provide, and these would be updates to the agent saying you have a new lead in our system. This email will then go to the agent and the application, who will parse it and get things like the email address and the name and the links to some of the listings that were provided, whatever's in the email, but that's all you can get. There is more qualifying data, the saved properties or lead traffic, for example. These are other actions leads have taken within our application, and this data is also valuable because it helps qualify the lead more. Where has a lead gone? What has a lead been looking at? And what properties or researches did a lead take an action on? Meaning, implying intent there. So to do that, you can't do it with email parsing. We don't provide all that information in the email to be parsed out. But there is a lot of quality data available via the API. This stands for Application Programming Interface, in case anyone's wondering. So more than the lead name, email, and address, you get who's receiving updates, saved searches, saved properties. You can get the traffic from the API, see which pages leads have been going around on their searching, and more. There's even more that can be done. So to use the API, first you have to be able to call the API in a RESTful manner. REST is a pretty standard concept of building APIs these days. It is built on the same kind of principles that our web browsers use. So kind of agreed upon status codes. 200 means good, everything's fine. 403 means a bad request or an unauthorized request, things like that. And the endpoints are just URLs. So here's an example endpoint here for the leads call. This is the main leads call to get lead data. You have to make this call via HTTPS for security, and this goes to our subdomain api.idxbroker.com, and then the kind of organizing here of the leads component, and then finally the lead endpoint. To make any of these calls to our API, you must have an IDX Broker account to receive an API key. This key would be passed along with your call to the endpoint. And this call will get you lead data in JSON, hopefully. We do provide XML, but JSON is probably best practice since it's, in my opinion, easier to work with, and most developers prefer JSON to XML from what I've seen. The consumption of XML here is not very high with the consumers of our API. So making this API call and getting this JSON, this is what it's going to look like. This would be the return from that API call. And these are the fields you're going to get every single time you make that call. This is going to be, the first name and last name and email, like you would in an email parse and email. But a secondary email, you get the phone number, the address, state, zip code, and country, and more information. So if there's an agent in the IDX Broker account who owns this lead was, say, captured on an agent bio page. So the lead is cookied into that agent, and now that agent owns that lead. You get the agent owner ID. The agent owner ID is an IDX ID. These can be also looked up with an API call. Whether or not the lead is disabled, whether the lead can log in, whether or not the lead is receiving updates is also available, and this is one of those fields that you can take an action on. So if a lead is not receiving updates, you might want to get that started for them or alert an agent that they're not getting updates. The subscribe date, last edited, this would be subscribe dates when they became a lead. The last edited would be the last time they edited their information. The last activity would be the last time they took an action, saving a property, for example. Custom registration fields is any registration field that you have added to our system on the lead capture form. That's where that would show up. And then a sum of the save searches and save properties. These last two are especially actionable if the sum changes. Your API calls are returning 0 one day for save searches and 1 or 3 the next day for save searches. That's an indicator that this lead is looking for something, and you can alert your application may alert an agent or may send something automatically to the lead. This API return is dummy data, and it's an example of 2 leads, Bruce Wayne and Peter Parker. But this is basically what you would be getting from your initial lead API call. So once you have that data, you're going to want to store the data and update your database. Our API does not have webhooks at the moment. We are working on webhooks to eliminate the need for polling, but for now, our consumers do poll the API, updating it often. Every 10 to 15 minutes, depending on other API use, is best practice. I've heard many applications wanting pseudo real-time under a minute. I'm not sure exactly what the urgent need is, considering the lead's still working around, probably on the side as after signing up. But it seems to be a little bit much. Even every 5 minutes is probably fine. We do recommend 10 to 15 just because the API limits are something to be taken into concern. And I'll get to more on what the limits are, as how many API calls you get per hour. Once you've stored the data and updated your database, you're probably going to want to derive from the data. So is the lead a priority now? Like I said, if the lead is not all of a sudden, the data is showing that the lead is saving searches or saving properties, this might be a time to alert an agent or send something automatically to the lead to nurture the lead along and hopefully try to convert to a sale. You may also, in your database, want to combine with other data from other sources. Once you have the email address or a name and a phone number, you can start looking other places, Facebook, Twitter, social networks that a lot of people are on, to find more data about this lead and maybe the best way to contact them. So maybe email is not the best, they prefer text messages, and your application can handle that. And you can start that once you have the information from our database into yours and start deciding whether you want to reach out via Facebook, SMS, anything else, or just phone calls, schedule a meeting. So you also may want to, once you've done whatever data additions you want to do or modifications, you may want to send this data to another source. For example, the SMS I mentioned, you may want to take that lead and send the phone number to an SMS service like Twilio or something, and start telling that service to store the phone number and the lead name and send out messages on your behalf. Or you may want to send it to a CRM or another type of CRM. We have quite a few CRMs that have an API that are consuming our data, and that data may be going on to other CRMs that are more specialized in some other facet, whether it's more email updates, video, creation of videos and updates. Most CRMs and applications have a niche they're trying to hit and can work together, passing along this data to move that lead along the sales funnel. You may also want to create content for your leads. So more than just consumption of it, you can assign property searches based on the data you already have gathered. You can assign specific properties, and this would have IDX Broker send the lead automatic email updates on these searches and properties. You can also manage leads here, like I said, assigning property searches, assigning them to agents, and that kind of management stuff. Creation, reading, and updating, deleting are available on most of the leads methods. So the limits I mentioned earlier, 250 calls per hour is for Platinum. I'll reiterate that in a second because it's pretty important. Also, the listing data beyond the listings belonging to agents is not available. I know some applications want to take the listing data itself and derive from that, but that's not something we can pass via the API currently. This is not really a technological limit. This is more of a policy limit. There are MLSs who won't allow us to pass it via API to any other application. The data is meant to be on the domain that was approved. So that's why we're not passing that data. We can pass the featured, what we call the featured properties, which are listings belonging to any agent or agents on the account. They must be the primary agent for this to happen, and this data is easily available via another API call. So if you're already making API calls for lead data, you can add another one for featured listing data. This is pretty useful when your application sees a property that's featured and a lead is interested. Well, then you can send more information or get the agent who owns that property to that lead more quickly. So let's go back to those best practices like I was talking about. Polling every 15 minutes, that's the recommended. This may or may not be the case if other applications are consuming the API. Like I said, there's a limit and everyone is accountable to the limit. So if my application is calling every 15 minutes and 10 others are calling every 15 minutes, then that's going to be 40 calls every hour, which isn't a lot, but there are other calls that may come into play here. So calling the lead endpoint first is a best practice to then determine if you need to call for saved properties or saved searches. If the sum of saved properties is 0 and searches is 0, then there's no need to make those secondary calls to get some more specific data about that lead saved searches. This will help keep the API limit or API calls under the limit for not only you, but your fellow applications that are consuming the API on the client's API key. So those limits are probably the biggest thing for best practices to keep in mind. You're not going to be the only one, and keeping the call volume to what you need really allows everyone to use the API. IDX Broker's WordPress plugin uses the API and makes several calls per hour as well. So any one application sending the API calls over the limit will trigger our system to stop the API calls for an hour. And that's a responsibility that all consumers of the API have to keep in mind. Platinum accounts get 250 calls per hour, Lite accounts get 125 calls per hour. So if your application is going to be pretty heavy on API calls, your clients would probably want to do the Platinum account to get those extra 100 calls. So the data addition also applies to those calls because each one of those is a post call as opposed to a get, but they're still API calls. The best practice is to update meaningfully, and what I mean by that is update what you need to update. If there's notes in your CRM, you may or may not need to update that in the IDX Broker system. The IDX Broker system has a notes area, but if you're a CRM and your application is holding all the notes and that's where the agents are going, you don't need to have exact parity. So it's not really meaningful to have the notes in both places if none of the agents are logging into the IDX Broker account and they're managing all their leads from your application. There are instances where you have to do large updates. I think the best example of this is going to be when an agent leaves like a brokerage and the leads need to be reassigned, allocated out to other agents. This could be 100, 200, lots of updates, and each one of these to change the agent that belongs, or the agent that owns the lead, is going to be an API call. Those are best scheduled for off hours when your agents aren't in your application making other API calls to do lookups, to do other updates, and batching those in, say, 100 API calls per hour over during some off-hour time is the best practice there. This also keeps the API calls to the minimum they need to be for that hour, and again is respectful to other consumers of the API on that client key. If your application is consuming IDX Broker data, we really like to feature those here on this page. You can find this page on our website under integrations. So you scroll down and you'll see we have different types of integrations here. The biggest consumer of our APIs is either WordPress, well, most of these do, but for our purposes, I'm going to look at CRMs. So there's an API integration here with these guys. Leading Agent has one as well. IMAX CRM all have API integration. So they're consuming our API data in different ways and at different levels. They may or may not be calling the lead traffic, or they may be deriving something else out of the data and then returning stuff. Each one has their own take on what they can do and how they can leverage the data on leads that we get or we provide from the API. And we like to feature them here. Even the email parsing is also featured here. Just anything that makes it easier for our customers to use our product and use the data that they're getting from our product. And that is something that we find makes clients happier and more successful. So if you have your own IDX Broker integration or you're building one, let me know. You can reach out to me. I'll have my email at the end of this video. Just reach out to me and I'll help get you on this page, help you with your application if possible. I've demoed a lot of these and worked with them to let these varying businesses know what kind of data they are using and what they could be using, and kind of like feature building. I'm also able to talk to the programmers, your developers, at the development level. So that's been very successful in getting this data out and leveraged in other applications. So if you want to know more, you can visit our docs. This is on our developer site, developers.idxbroker.com. There's a little IDX Dev logo. This is a site we have for developers, and it's all developer-oriented material. It's a good resource site for anybody who has IDX Broker clients. It's good to check it out. There's lessons on API consumption. There's lessons on troubleshooting IDX Broker issues if you also make websites and are a developer partner in that regard. There's just a ton of information there about our API and being a developer when working with IDX Broker. So I encourage everyone to go visit that subdomain if they're going to be consuming our data. So that's it. Thanks for attending today. I'm glad I was able to talk about this. The API consumption is, like I said, one of my big roles here, and it's fun for me to talk about APIs and programming. This webinar was recorded and will be available on the IDX Broker YouTube channel. If you have any other questions, you can always email me directly, antonio@idxbroker.com. So with that being said, thanks again for coming, and let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to email me anytime.